Hey everyone, so I tried recording this once into Canvas and apparently it didn't want to upload. So this is take two. All right, so how long do I expect a sermon to be? Typically, at our church, our pastors preach for about 25 to 30 minutes, somewhere in there. Some days we'll get a little bit more than that. Um, but for me, 25 to 30 minutes is kind of the sweet spot, I feel. I think if going shorter, then it doesn't feel like there's enough. But then going longer than much longer than a half hour or so, it almost feels like sometimes you're getting into more teaching rather than preaching, and maybe there's aspects that's good, but I don't know. That's just kind of my thoughts and my observations. Um, as far as structure of a sermon, I really appreciate kind of a more of a narrative style, that. And with that said, like there should be an argument or a point to the story, because I think sometimes we can get into telling the story of a sermon or getting into a narrative of a passage, but then not actually get to a point. And so I think that it's important to do that. And so I think some of the better teaching that I've seen, or better preaching that I've seen, has taken a single passage, um, and told the story of the passage, and being able to connect kind of from the beginning, something that's relatable to me, and speak through the passage from scripture, and come out at the end, uh, with something to do or an action, at the end of the passage. And so that's kind of my thoughts about that. Verse by verse exposition is great, and I think that there's a place for it. I think I think it would be hard week to week, um, in a church setting, to go verse by verse through. I know some churches that go verse by verse through the book of Matthew or whatever. Like that seems like it would take a long time. And so and so verse by verse is not something that I connect with as well. Although I think that it's a great tool for studying the Bible, but I wonder about if it's as good for preaching. Anyways, that's just a thought. As far as whether the preacher will have a full manuscript or just preach from notes or no notes and visuals and all that, uh, I think I think a good manuscript preacher will be able to read from their manuscript and still connect well with the congregation. I think the danger that I see sometimes with manuscript preachers are the fact that they do not. Uh, they sit up there and it's almost as if they are reading their sermon, and that just doesn't it's hard to connect to the congregation that way. And so as I said, I've seen some great manuscript preachers that are able to read from their manuscript, but they also are able to have the freedom to step away from their manuscript and connect to the congregation and relate to the congregation a little bit. And I think that is a great way to go. Um, I also love being able to watch uh, preachers get up and go with no notes. I think it's impressive, and I think that there are. I know that there's lots of prep that goes into being able to do that, and so that's something that's great to see. But for the most part, I think I've seen preachers with notes, being able to come back to their notes, and if they feel like they're getting off track or whatever the case is, and being able to get back onto their argument or their story or whatever the style is that they're doing. And as far as visuals go, in my context, the typically the only visuals that happen are something up on PowerPoint, maybe some pictures or maybe a video every once in a while. Usually, if there's a video, it's not during the sermon; it's actually before the sermon to set something up, rather than taking a break in the middle of the sermon. Um, but I also think working with students, I think actual physical props and uh, visuals are important too, because it, especially in our screen-based lifestyle, digital lifestyle. I think that we're very used to watching things on a screen, but to have something live and physical and to be able to look at and interact with visually, I think is an important thing to do. And so I try and use props. A lot of times, maybe not a full like object lesson necessarily, but some sort of prop to draw attention to something physical. And but at the same time, I use a lot of video clips and I use pictures and stuff too on PowerPoint and whatnot. So that's something that I feel is good. Um, as far as the use of the preacher's voice, I think this is super important because I think inflection and cadence and speed of the words that we say can draw people in, and the when we speed up our what we say, it could draw people to more of a climax, and then to be able to slow down our speech, we'll be able to draw them in to help them listen and know the importance of what's being said. And so and being able to speak louder and softer, I think it's just a dramatic way to be able to include the congregation in what the preacher is saying. And so I think voice is very important. And as far as how does a preacher use their body, whether they sit or stand or walk around, I personally feel like the preacher should be walking around, especially if it's a stage of some sort, a chancel of some sort that is bigger, that to be able to connect to the congregation, to be able to move to the left side of the chancel or the right side. I think that's an important thing, to be able to include the congregation and draw them into what's being said. Um, and I also just find it can be awkward for a preacher to just sit behind a pulpit and not move from there, and it makes me as someone listening to them just feel like they are not engaging. And so that's just kind of my experience and my thoughts on that. Um, as far as connecting emotionally, I think that's very important for the preacher to connect emotionally with the congregation, and to be open and vulnerable, because the reality is that I think that as preachers, and when we look at scripture, and when we talk to our congregations, and we expect them to be vulnerable and open with us and with God. And if we are not open and vulnerable and emotional in how we interact with them, then we want to model the same behaviors that we are asking them to do. And so I think the best way to do that is to be open and vulnerable, and to be emotional on stage. I think that just brings an authenticity and a reality to what is coming from the scriptures. And so I think that's an important thing to do. At the same time, I think it can be dangerous, because I've seen lots of, not lots, but I've seen preachers who have manipulated the situation because of emotions, and so I think that there's definitely a balance that needs to be there, and there needs to be just it needs to be authentic emotion, not contrived. And so that's yeah. As far as what I expect the sermon to accomplish, is I expect a sermon to draw people closer to God, and I expect it to draw them to a place where they are taking the next step in their relationship with God, and their relationship with others. And so there should be an action to it. There should be, I'm going to change something as a result of the sermon. as opposed to, hey, that was good information. If it's good information, I feel like I can get that from a Bible class. But if the information, I think in preaching, the information that I'm saying from Scripture and what God has led, the Spirit has moved through me to say from the Scripture should inspire an action. And so I expect the preacher to challenge me to do something different in my life in order to draw closer to God, which for some people that may be a first time commitment. And for others that may be just changing the way that they've been living this past week in order to draw closer to God this coming week. And so I think preaching is about inspiring action. And as far as um, what the sermon is to lead to, similarly, I think it needs to lead to a response. And for, I know many churches, the response might be a worship song at the end, and maybe that's communion, but it's a response to remember who Jesus is, and it's a response to remember why we're there in a time of worship. And um, I think the response is important to the sermon because we can go and sit and listen to a motivational speaker, and they can inspire us to live differently. But a response to worship is important because we're not changing our lives and we're not changing our actions just to make things better for us, but we're changing our actions and we're drawing closer to God in an act of worship and a response of worship to the one who created us and the one who loves us and saved us. And so I think that some sort of response, whether that of worship is important, whether that is communion or a song of worship or offering is giving of our gifts and our resources is all just an important response to what the sermon has said. So those are my thoughts. Hopefully this will record this time so I don't have to do this again. All right, bye.